All right. So, hi, guys. I'm William Elvey. You all can call me Bill. We're here today to talk about programming. Um, what we're going to cover is kind of like the precursor. So, we're going to cover today about things you should not see before you actually get to the data transfer portion of things. Um, for some of you, this is going to be territory that you're pretty well versed in, that you've done who knows how many flashes, and you're pretty cool with actually doing the whole process on your own. Some of the guys out there, they're looking at doing programming, maybe haven't done it once, twice, maybe none at all. So basically, what we're going to cover today is I'm hoping for the guys that have done programming that you pick up one thing. If you picked up one little bit of information, I've done my job correctly. And for the other guys, if you got questions, take as much of this information and keep it close, because it'll help you out in the long run. So let me give you a little history about me. I started in this industry when I was about 15 years old. Started working at a gas station when they actually pumped gas for you. And it was a little station down in Dearborn. Worked for a guy named George. And George had me mainly sweeping floors, pumping gas, checking oil, all the basic things. The technician that George had working for him in the garage, his name was Steve. Steve was the guy that started me down this road. He was, let's just call him, he was my master. He taught me all the basic mechanical things, mechanical skills, proper mindsets, how to look at something and try to basically deconstruct it and figure out how it operates before you actually even touch it. The stuff that he taught me, I've used throughout my entire career. Worked for those guys. I did that for about 3 years, moved up the street to a little trans shop down there in Dearborn. Became self-reliant at that particular point, because being a little mom and pop trans shop, didn't have service information, didn't have a lot of things that most of you guys have now. So as an R&R guy, I stood there, looked at the situation underneath the car, and basically reverse engineered the car in my mind before I started taking it apart. It taught me to analyze things, to actually look at things and say, hey, this looks good. This is something about that doesn't seem to look quite right. Gave you a good mindset to figure out on your own if something was broke or how to take it apart. Finally went to work in a full service repair facility a couple of years after that. That's where I became a drivability technician and electrical. That's always been my favorite field of endeavor. You get used to doing certain things and you work on drivability, then all of a sudden you're the guy that gets every weird car that comes through the door. A lot of this stuff I've learned on my own. I go to as many classes as I can find, always updating knowledge. A few years later, I started to kind of lose it physically. Can't really do the physical portion of the job anymore, but my brain still works fine. And it was either, hey, quit automotive industry altogether, go find something that gives me enough income that I can continue as in the way I'm used to living. But what I ended up doing is I took the physical portion out of it, and I went to work for a company, Drew Technologies. So they hired me in as a wrap technician. So for any of you guys who don't know what wrap is yet, that's remote assisted programming. So basically all I did all day was program cars. You learn how to troubleshoot a little bit without actually having to see the car. Some of the things that we're going to talk about today are basically the things that I've seen that lead me into things to ask a client on the phone, hey, do you have a battery maintainer or a battery charger hooked up to this car? Things of that nature. So let's get into it. there. So we've got an exclusive webinar offer today. Free battery maintainer with the purchase of a DrivePro ES. So the DrivePro licensed OE diagnostic software, 360 support comes with it, built-in remote flash programming. So you can, as you see, hit that little drive wrap button and one of the guys will call you. So with that DrivePro ES, we've got a $600 battery maintainer that's going to cost you all of $0. So that would be something to give a good consideration to. All right, let's jump in. So everything here is going to all start and end with battery. What we're working on is electrical in nature. This is the thing that buffers the AC voltage coming out of the alternator. It does more than just start the car. Battery condition is, and I can't really stress this enough, battery condition before you do any type of flash to a vehicle is absolutely paramount. Now, you can run into a few things here where it says, okay, so you're getting ready to flash the vehicle, you've got everything hooked up, you've got your maintainer hooked up, gauge on your maintainer is telling you, hey, we're sitting at 13.2 volts. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the car, that the network that module is on, is seeing that 13.5 volts. Because you have it on the gauge at the maintainer does not mean that at the ADL, where we're plugged in at with our pass-through, that you're getting 13.5 volts at that ADL. That's where the programming system is going to check your voltage. So if it's not 13.5 there, some of the actual flash software won't even start until you have fixed that situation. So again, can't stress it enough, battery condition, absolutely necessary. You need to go through and take a little time. Number one, make sure the battery is right for the car. What you're going to run into if it is a smaller battery than it's supposed to be is not enough reserve capacity, not enough amperage output capacity to actually do what we're about to do. Some of the vehicles out there take quite a bit of amperage to keep alive while they're in programming mode. Off the top of my head, some of the BMWs will actually put a load of 80, 90 amps while you're doing a programming. You've got to keep the battery voltage up. Otherwise, you're going to run into problems. Checking the battery to make sure the battery is good. If you have a battery that appears to be good, and this is a habit that I got into a while back, is I always check a battery twice. I'll check a battery the first time. I grew up in the era of carbon piles, and they don't really say that they recommend those anymore. But still, whatever you have to check the battery, always do a check. And then what I usually do is I wait about 10 minutes after that first test, and I go back and do the test over again. Some instances, you're going to find that you've got a bad battery and you need to replace it. You don't want to find that out in the middle of a flash. If you find that out the hard way, voltage drops to a certain point, programming system shuts down, all of a sudden now, you've got whatever module you were flashing, whatever ECU it was. Now all of a sudden you've got something that's good to keep a door open. That's it. You just turned a $800 module into a doorstop. Moving up. So, battery maintainers. Having a good battery maintainer that can keep up with the current demand in the car while you're programming, again, can't stress it enough, absolutely necessary. Battery maintainers are just exactly what their name implies. They are not chargers. If you start a programming with a low battery, hoping the battery maintainer will make up for that, you may be exceeding the current output that the maintainer was designed to give you. And again, we're back to the voltage drop, programming event ceases, and you now have a brick for an engine controller. So here's how the two different things work. Battery charger supplies a battery with consistent amperage and varying voltage to charge it. Battery maintainer supplies a steady voltage but varying current depending upon the load that it's put on. Always use a battery charger. Again, cannot stress it enough. Always use a battery maintainer for programming and a charger for a battery that needs to be charged. The maintainer doesn't have the little peaks and valleys in the current that comes out of it, or the voltage that comes out of it, sorry, that a battery charger would. This can come up as interference in the programming language. Once you've gone through and you've double checked and say, hey, I got a good 13.5 at the DLC, according to the software, we're good. You've gone through, you made sure all of the connectors are tight, that your cables are on tight. Once you're done there, we move on to the actual network in the car. So here is another place where we can look at this and say, hey, we're doing a transmission control module. This is a healthy network. This is something that doesn't have an unprogrammed module in it. You will have DTCs in a module that isn't programmed. You will also on occasion have DTCs in other modules because of said module not being programmed. Looking at this, this is a frame from a GDS2, and as you see, you can see what vehicle we were working on here, an 18 Equinox. And like I said, you look down here and you see 13.8 volts. Long as you see that in your software before you launch, you're going to be in good shape. Also, looking at this, like I said, this is a clean and green screen. Everything here is happy. Everything here is connected. The ones that you see with the basic stop sign here, chassis control module, pedestrian alert, active safety, don't necessarily stress out when you see these. You have to check and see if your vehicle is actually equipped with those. So that's something that you, again, have to do a little bit of research before you start the flash. So when you see these red flags, you can go back and say, oh, hey, ain't nothing wrong with that. It's not equipped with a headlamp control module. So going through these tests and checking to see that, like I said, let's say we're talking about a transmission controller here. With a transmission controller, you need the engine control module online to do this. Depending upon the module that you are actually flashing. We talk about an engine control module in the same Equinox. You're going to need the engine controller, you're going to need the body controller, and you're going to need whatever security setup it has on it. Being an 18, this is an immobilizer setup. What we're talking about is a specific module may rely on 4 or 5 other modules to feed it data in order for it to do the job that it is meant to do. Always go back, check your service information. Most of the time, it'll tell you that, hey, if you're installing this, make sure this is up to date and this is up to date. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to go in there and flash them, but you need to at least check to make sure that they're within the update range that they require for that particular software that you're installing in the module that you're working on. Almost never have I seen a vehicle that was not completely put together get a successful flash. Problem is you don't know what's not done yet. So if you get that car from, the local shop down the street, local collision shop, and they say, hey, we need to move this around a little bit. Can you guys install this engine controller, flash it for us so we can move the car around in the shop while we're finishing it up? A lot of times it's worth your time investment to go ahead and plug into it and see what exactly may be missing on the network. Again, you got to make sure that the red flags that you're seeing aren't because it's not equipped. You've got to make sure that the vehicle's equipped with them. So you're going to need a VIN, and it's a good time to go through and say, hey, I checked the network in this car, and there's a couple of modules that aren't responding that I need in order to program the one that you want programmed. So you're probably going to have to put this one completely together before we can actually help you out with that. Going to save you time and trouble in the long run. All of the modules on the network should respond one way or another. All the related modules to the one that you're working on, you should not have communication codes between themselves and the module you're working on, or just between themselves. If you run across communications DTCs, real important here to know that your communication DTC, is it a current DTC? Is it a history DTC? Is it a permanent DTC? Is it a pending DTC? It all depends on the situation, how the vehicle was put together, when the battery was hooked up, did somebody unplug something and plug it back in? That'll give you communication codes, and it might cost you some time in the long run, but doing a little investigation is going to by far save you more time than it won't. Big thing, connections. Connectors, clean, dry. If you see any green corrosion, if you see any kind of anything on them, double check it. Make sure it's clean. If you're going to use anything on it, make sure it's something that's compatible with the connector itself and is not going to do damage to the connector or to the controller that you plugged it into. When you're checking your connections, you're looking at that body shop car. Man, I can't get my pass-through to communicate with this. If you've got a car right next to it, go plug into the other car. It's a good idea to make sure that they're as close as possible to the same type of construction. That way the network will be similar to what you were looking at, maybe not exactly the same. We'll go back to that headlight controller. Maybe it's got the fancy headlights in it. But if you could communicate with the other car and you can't communicate with this one, you know your hardware is good and your issue lies in the car somewhere else. You plugged your pass-through in. You can't communicate with the car you were intending on working on. Can't communicate with the one next to it either. Is there an update for your pass-through? Is there an update for your laptop? Is there an update for your software? The programming systems, certain ones, live in a virtual environment. So you're basically logging into a website and then it houses the programming system. Not all manufacturers do it the same way. Some of them, you have to update software. Ford is my favorite one. They throw updates out there fast and furious. On occasion, you will get 2 updates in the same month for Ford software. If you're not working with the latest and greatest, and you're working on some really late model cars, let alone have connection issues, you may have a problem with just even finding out what the car is. In other words, addressing the vehicle and having it tell you what it is. Check your tool for updates. Make sure there are no driver updates for your pass-through. Make sure your programming system's up to date. Now, we're going to circle right back around again. Power. We're going right back to the battery again. While you're in there, and once you've got your connections all set up, you can tell that everything's going good because you can see the voltage through the vehicle software. If your voltages are below their normal thresholds, you may have a connection issue because there's not enough voltage to wake up the entire vehicle, the entire network, or even just the module that you're trying to work on. Always make sure that you have a proper power supply hooked up to the vehicle. Let's talk a little bit about the vehicle as a whole here. Now we're going to look at the network. So your network, as you see the young lady there, you have multiple modules talking to multiple modules on the network, talking to 4 or 5 modules between engine control, stability control, anti-lock brakes, steering. All these have to have proper communications. You may have issues and just installing software if you have a communication issue with a particular module, between particular modules. We're going to go back to DTCs again. Usually trouble codes will give you a hint as to what's going on. You can't have a transmission communication code in a transmission control module. The trans controller can always talk to itself. If you're having a connection issue with the transmission controller, you're going to see that U code in the modules that require its input. You're not going to see it in the module itself. Almost always. There are a couple of exceptions. Almost always, you're going to have some type of DTC in the module you're servicing that basically says, hey, I don't know what I'm sitting in. Or, hey, that data from the other module that I need to talk to doesn't make any sense. What you're looking at is pretty good verification that you have a good connection to that trans controller. Engine controller doesn't understand it because they haven't been programmed. They haven't been formally introduced. Checking the DTCs that you get to see is it a current DTC? Is it a history DTC? Is this something it saw, when the module itself actually failed before you even started working on it? Got to make sure that you know what type of relevance the code has. Just because it's a U code and it's a communications code, if it's not current or pending, erase it, see if it returns. If it does, take a little time, investigate it. A little time spent here will save you a lot of money and a lot of time later. Back to the network again, you want to look for data. One of the biggest misconceptions that I see guys make when I was working in the wrap department would be, you would get a guy that would call you up, you would try to program the module, and one of the couple of questions that I always ask, hey, have you plugged your scan tool into this? Can you see that module? Can you see it on the network? A lot of times, well, no. You got to program it before it'll communicate, right? We get that a lot. Almost every vehicle, even if you install a completely and totally blank module, brand new from the factory, there is going to be an ability to connect to it, to actually pull codes from it, and to pull data from it. It will show you the data. It may not understand what the data means at the moment because until it's programmed, it doesn't know what it's working in. But you should still be able to see the data. Again, like I said, there's a couple of exceptions out there. Some of the FCA products, they don't necessarily communicate. A PCM will not communicate necessarily until after it's been programmed. Most of the time, though, it has set, and we'll go back to that one real quick, it has set a code in another module for invalid data. I don't understand what that other module is saying, which means it's there. It just hasn't been programmed yet. We're going to now stop and talk about the module itself. That antique right there, that's a good place to start. There were a lot of pinout issues with that particular style of module that GM produced. The connectors were so-so at best. You would have intermittent communication issues. I can go back to the actual worst one that I've ever seen that still functioned would have come out of a Savannah van when they used to install that module underneath the brake master cylinder. That pretty black paint would go away from the brake fluid, and the module would literally disintegrate because of environmental issues. We're from Michigan. A lot of salt, snow, rain, dirt. I have actually picked up modules that would still run a vehicle minus that metal cover on the outside of it, literally holding on to a PC board. You should always be able to identify the module you've installed on the network. Like I said, there are a couple of exceptions out there, but for the most part, you plug it in. And if you just do a network check, it may not know what it is and what it's going to do for you, but it will at least tell you it's there. Most modules, once you plug them in, they're a little more intelligent than you think they are. They still have their processing capabilities, and they can give you live data. Should always be able to pull data from a majority of the vehicles that you're working on. It may not make sense, but you should have the ability to go in there and look. And if you see live data, you're in good shape. It's usually ready to be programmed. Trouble codes. Again, another hint that, yeah, it's there. It just hasn't been programmed yet. Trouble codes and other modules for, again, that communication issue where I don't understand the data that I'm seeing, but I see data. Service bulletins. When you see a TSB for programming, if you go in and you do a code search and say, hey, I had these codes, while you're in there and you've deduced that it needed a module, check for service bulletins. This is stuff that a lot of guys like us have figured out that is a habitual problem with that particular type of vehicle. And with TSBs, it is VIN specific. So if you punch your VIN into your service information, there's no TSB for that particular communication issue that requires you to, let's say, unplug the body control module, unplug the radio, and stand on your left foot while patting your head. Then you don't have to worry about that with that particular vehicle. All TSBs don't fit all vehicles. All vehicles don't fit all TSBs. We're going to take a look at some of the codes that you're going to see when you launch the programming system. Before any data transfer happens, we've got an error code. This is stuff you're going to see, and we're talking specific to GM here. This is stuff you're going to see when you get into SPS and you actually push the play button. Once SPS contacts the vehicle, their server stack is going to interrogate that vehicle. You've already told it what you wanted to program. It figures out what the data set is that particular module with that particular VIN needs, and it's now going to install it. What we're looking at here is an E6961. What it means is that SPS found a problem, needs to shut down, and try it again. It doesn't quite understand what it saw, but it saw an issue that it did not like. What's going to happen here is it's going to run through and it's going to attempt to program that module 3 times. When it's done, it's going to pop up a secondary set of errors. Those are not necessarily the ones you want to look at. If you relaunch this whole thing over again, it'll have you put the vehicle back in, the VIN back in, and you launch it again. You should get a different error code as opposed to the 6961. It may be one of the other ones that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. It may be the same one. On occasions, I have seen when you get the same one again, what you want to do is just stop, unhook, shut everything down, including the vehicle, start it all up again, try it a second time. Sometimes it's just a glitch where internet speed dropped off for a second. The server over at Warren had a little hiccup. Sometimes you'll start this over again and you won't get any error codes. Programming flies right through. If you get a different code, then you refer to the other ones that we're going to look at. You would refer to those and then try to diagnose the issue from there. 6961 is basically, I don't know what happened, but something happened. So, M4404, E4404. What this is SPS can't see your programming interface. It can't see your pass-through device. Again, check all your connections. Again, go back, look at the battery. Make sure you've got enough power in that car. Shut the software down, restart it. Still persists. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to unplug the interface. If the actual application won't shut down, go into Device Manager, force the shutdown. You can disable it and then re-enable it. That's basically, again, almost like unplugging it and plugging it back in. If all else fails, you've gone through all these steps. We could go back to something that we talked about earlier with communications. Let's move over to another car that has a similar system in it. See if we can communicate with it. If you can, you know your problem is quite possibly isolated to that vehicle. This is a problem where SPS cannot see your interface. Could be an internet issue. If you're working wirelessly, now's the time to talk about always using a hard cable. All the vehicles that we all sit in now, Bluetooth, they have tire pressure monitors in them. They have radar sensors in them. All this RF interference. If you are not hard cabled between the interface and your PC or laptop, and your laptop or PC is not hard cabled to the internet, now's the time. Let's go get those cables and let's ensure that we don't have an RF interference issue causing something like this. 4399, 4403. Something has happened and it has lost communications with the module it was programming and your interface. So something in the car shut down, started up, caused a drop in battery voltage. Some vehicles, it can be a millisecond drop below a particular threshold, and it's going to disconnect itself. Could be something in the vehicle chattering on your CAN line. We're going to talk about aftermarket components. You install an aftermarket radio in GM products, some of the older ones, you have to put a little device called a chime module in it. The chime module takes the place of the original equipment battery or original equipment radio, and it makes the sounds that you hear when you leave your headlights on, you forget to fasten your seatbelt, you left your keys in the truck. All those are processed through the original equipment radio in a GM product. If you don't have the original equipment radio, most of the aftermarket installers install this little chime module. Well, our chime module doesn't speak GM. All it knows is that here's a particular signal across the CAN line, and it makes a particular noise. In the process of programming, if it hears its particular signal, it makes its particular noise. This chatter on the communication line can cause this type of issue. It basically, the programming system sees data coming across the line that it doesn't understand. It shuts down. E4394, server error. You don't run into this a ton. But when you do run into it, what it is the software that you're installing in that vehicle, there was an issue with the server that was supplying you with said software. First step, go through, shut SPS completely down. You don't have to back all the way out of it, but you have to shut the service programming system down completely. Once it's closed, reopen it, see if your code comes back. If your E4394 comes back, in my opinion, don't immediately jump on the phone and call TechLine. Give it a few minutes. Give it 10 or 15 minutes. Sometimes these are a matter of too much load on a particular server and things got confused. The server couldn't handle the file transfer. After about 10 or 15 minutes, you make your third attempt. If it doesn't work then it's time to call the guys over at the Delco help desk. A lot of times they will, when you call them and they answer your call and you say, hey, I'm getting an error, E4394. They'll tell you, yes, we are experiencing some computer issues and we are efforting the repair as we speak. This could take anywhere from an hour to a day. I've had this problem and it has persisted throughout almost an entire 8-hour day. Eventually, GM will get it fixed because they're in the business to make money and they will repair this. And they are usually pretty Johnny on the spot with how often it happens and with how long it takes to actually fix. E4398. This is an interesting little one. So 4398 means you've asked the GM SPS servers a question they can't really answer. What it is that your calibration file, your specific software for your specific vehicle and your specific VIN is no longer on the server stack. This is one of the ones where a lot of guys get a little antsy and it's like, oh, no calibration data. This one must have to go back to the dealer. It's not the time to send your customer to a dealership to have this done. In SPS, the dealers get the same access pretty much as we do to these data files. If that data file is not there for you, it's not there for your dealership down the road. Somebody's going to have to make a phone call to GM. It usually doesn't take very long, and they do the server replacement, put the info back in the server rack while you're on the phone with them. Most of the time, that's the way it happens. There are occasions where, hey, it's going to be an hour, and then we'll have that on there for you. You can call us back and double check, or you can just attempt the flash in about an hour. This error has nothing to do with anything, but There's not enough server space for every single vehicle that's ever been created to have their software parked in a server that may or may not get used in 2 or 3 years. As the vehicles get older, things drop off the end. So you can put new things on the front side. GM doesn't have unlimited server space. They have to make sacrifices here and there. The easy part of this, once you make that phone call, they'll put it back in there, and then they'll leave it there for usually the length of the subscription time. So if you're buying GM SPS subscription for a particular vehicle, that's usually about how long that added piece of information will stay on that server rack. They may pull it after that. Not the end of the world. Don't panic. It's not that GM doesn't service the vehicle anymore. It's that GM's running out of server room. Note, we're going to talk a little bit about a kind of a communication issue, kind of not a communication issue. What this is going to be about if you're working on an 07 or older GM vehicle. The speed in which they communicate. In other words, the speed that the modules talk to each other and the speed in which the GM server talks to a particular module while you're doing flash programming. Most modern tooling can talk faster than these vehicles can actually understand. I've had issues where you try it once or twice and all of a sudden it takes off and it goes and it programs just fine. I will tell you, the older the vehicle, the more predominant this issue becomes. Also kind of odd, and this is something that I'm not going to tell you that I can 100% approve. The older the vehicle, if it has had a remanufactured powertrain controller or whatever module it happens to be that you're putting in, once these modules go through the remanufacturing process, they seem to be a little bit quicker. They seem to be a little bit faster. And you don't have this issue with most of the time if you've installed a reman in it. This is one of those instances where if you see that you're having a communication problem with it, I would advise the customer, the person that owns the vehicle, and tell them, hey, we're going to try to program this because it needs this update for this particular issue. If this update won't install, we're going to need to possibly replace your powertrain controller. Tell them up front because these older vehicles have this issue. When all else fails, the Legacy Tech 2 option in SPS slows the speak rate down. In other words, slows the transfer rate down to a point where most of those vehicles can actually comprehend what the tooling is telling it. You're going to need an actual Tech 2 to do this with. If you don't have one, I have tried multiple ways and I have played videos while trying to do the programming in order to slow my computer's processing rate down to a point where this is less likely to be a problem with the vehicle. Play YouTube videos, have your laptop doing downloads for other software or something. Don't do anything that may interfere with your actual programming, but try to get the laptop to pay attention to something else while it's doing your programming. What that'll do, it'll slow the transfer rate down a little bit and give you possibly what you're looking for, which is an updated module. There are occasions where none of this is going to work. And the only option that you have after that, replacement to a remanufactured module, even some of the remans, when you get into the really old flash programmable powertrain controllers, even some of the remans are going to have this problem on the initial install. If that's the case, you're going to have to find yourself a tech 2. The MDIs, the original MDI and not the 2, the original MDI also is a possibility that this will talk slow enough for that vehicle to understand. So let's recap. So we've talked about battery health. I'm going to beat on that particular subject forever. The battery in a vehicle is usually one of the most overlooked items and has the biggest bearing on what you're about to do if you're trying to update software in a vehicle in a particular module. Battery health, again, I can't stress enough. Make sure you have a good battery. Make sure the battery is correct in its application, that battery was built with that vehicle in mind. You are going to have vehicles out there where that amp hour rating of that battery, if you put one in that's maybe 10 amp hours less, you are not going to survive the programming. Got to be the right battery for it. Has to be fully charged. Before doing the flash is the time to say, hey, I need to put this on the battery charger and let this charge up slowly. If it costs you a half a day of putting that vehicle on a very slow trickle charge and you get that battery back, short of replacing the battery on the spot, it's way better to burn the half a day in charging it than it is to have to wait quite possibly a week or two for another controller to show up because it quit programming in the middle. Network health. Run through all the modules on the network. Make sure that everything is as it should be, short of the one that you're programming. Even the one you're programming, you're going to go take a look at it and make sure that it shows up. Again, the vehicle may not understand what is there, but it knows something is there. That way you know that the network recognizes it, that the vehicle recognizes it, and the other modules on the network recognize it. Saves a lot of time to make sure that happens before you start programming, as opposed to trying to launch a programming and not understanding why it's not successful. Module health. Any of the guys that have been out there a while, I am sure you have pulled bad parts out of a box. I cannot count the amount of times that I have pulled a module out of the box, plugged it in, no good. These are imperfect machines built by imperfect people. You are going to have an occasion where that brand new $800 engine controller is no good from the jump. Not a matter of you bought it from the wrong place or somebody mishandled it. Things like that are going to happen eventually. The longer you work in this industry, the more you're going to realize that every once in a while, you're going to pull a bad part out of a box. So, let's talk about our exclusive webinar offer again. So the DrivePro ES, again, OE diagnostic software, all licensed, live brand specific, and I'm one of those guys. I'm the GM guy. You may get me if you call in for repair info. Also, built-in pass-through. Latest and greatest technology. If you buy that DrivePro ES, we are going to supply you with a battery maintainer. And as you see from the specs, 90 amps, output voltage is 13.4, right there in that sweet spot where you want it. We're going to supply you that battery maintainer. This is also the maintainer that we put in our wrap kits. So if you have a wrap kit and you have us do flash programming for you, this is the same battery maintainer that you get in that other product. We're going to give you that for the whole sum of $0. And again, that offer is going on until January 20th.
Well, hey, Bill, how's it going?
Not too bad.
How are you feeling after that?
Pretty good.
Yeah, some really great information out there. Got some time
Absolutely.
for Q&A? All right, cool. We got a couple cool questions. One of the things I'd like to note, you brought it up towards the end, kind of the point, an unprogrammed module should still communicate.
Absolutely.
Because I noticed even when I used to do some of the rap, people would call up asking for programming, and it was a no communication problem.
Right.
So I would stress that an unprogrammed module should communicate.
There should be some evidence when you plug into it with a scan tool. There should be some evidence of its existence in the vehicle. Again, it may not know exactly what it's for or exactly what it's trying to tell you, but it knows it's there.
Great. So we had another thing. Let's go back to the beginning. We'll talk about the batteries because we like beating that dead horse.
Love that.
So you're telling me that I can't take my half-dead battery from my Prius, put it in my 2018 Escalade, and try to program this car?
Well, I mean, you're welcome to try, but I really don't think that you're going to get very far. And that's kind of an interesting pair right there, because the Prius has a very tiny battery. We affectionately call that a 9-volt. It's a 12-volt DC battery, but it's kind of sort of about the size of a 9-volt battery compared to most other batteries on the market. That Escalade has way more current requirements than that little battery. Even if it wasn't half dead, that little battery would not survive long inside of that Escalade.
Exactly. So we had a couple questions about global.
And then a secondary thing.
Oh, well, go on.
Absolutely. Go ahead. Let's talk about global A, and then I'll beat the battery horse again before we're done.
So we had a couple questions about global A and used modules. You want to talk about those a little bit?
Absolutely.
All right, let's go.
So, all right. So, global A. Let's talk about what global A actually means. So, it's basically firmware inside of a particular controller that when you do an initial install, let's just say that when it was initially installed at the factory, the VIN was written to it. So the VIN is like, let's think of it as almost like a password. Once the VIN is written, a global A module usually will have to go through a remanufacturing process in order to erase that VIN before you are capable of flashing it to a different vehicle. There are some vehicles out there where, and we do run into this with remanufactured aftermarket modules on occasion, where yes, it will install and work, but yet you keep flagging codes for a VIN mismatch. The vehicle knows that that other quote unquote password is incorrect, and it flags a code because of it. Good. Once it's been through the reman process, you could go ahead and write it to another vehicle, but usually until that happens, and I'm not going to say 100% of the time, but a very, very high percentage in the 90s, if that hasn't been through a remanufacturing process, you're not going to get it to install in another vehicle.
Makes a lot of sense. So we had another question here about updates and calibrations.
Right.
So they said, if a module shows an updates available, but it doesn't pertain to our vehicle's issue, would you still suggest updating the module?
So this goes to a kind of a heavily argued point in our industry where there's a lot of places out there that, you know, they've spent their money on a DrivePro ES, and they've spent their money on a Cardac 3, or they've spent their money on whoever's pass-through and tool that they use, and they're trying to recoup some of this money. To program or reprogram modules as maintenance is kind of a sketchy deal. A lot of car companies, and the one that, and we're not, well, I won't stick with solely General Motors here. If you go back and you look at Honda and Toyota, Toyota actually tailors their flash software for those particular service bulletins. And it guides you through the diagnostic process and says, well, if you have this calibration number, you need to update to this calibration number because of this set of circumstances. If your vehicle does not slot exactly into there, it is very ill-advised to update a module just to update it. You're better off saying, hey, this vehicle doesn't have any updates at the moment. We need to take another look at what the issue actually is with it and see if we can come up with a different explanation.
That's really good. Okay, so let's have another question here. What's the best possible way to find the latest calibration available for the ECU outside of the dealer?
Outside of the dealer?
Yeah.
Well, a majority of the OEs, and we'll take, well, let's go with General Motors. So in General Motors portal, if you want to call it that, there is a place where you can actually install the VIN into a particular screen, and it will ask you different questions about the vehicle, and it kind of resembles the actual SPS software. Basically, what it's doing, it's taking your VIN number. You can then, with a scan tool, and a lot of guys don't really know where this data is at in the vehicle, but you can usually take with a scan tool, inquire inside of a module, and ask it, hey, what software level are you at? That response, you would take and compare that number with the number in the support portal. Once you've installed the VIN, if you have a numerically higher number in the GM system than you do in the vehicle, then more than likely that's your update right there.
Okay, great. So we have a question from Oz. Oz wants to know, first of all, how do we get to Oz? Secondly, wants to know about the Yellow Brick Road. Also, he wants to know, how do we find out which vehicle has Global A? He says, with GM, I've noticed that some vehicles, Global A started in 2010 and some are 2012 and 2014.
So now I wish I had the GM entranceway in front of me, but without even logging in to the GM website, there is a resource. And if you go and you click on that resource tab, it'll have a drop down, and click on scan tool. And what it'll show you is basically a breakdown of when each one of the vehicle models and vehicle lines that GM produces, it will give you the year that it turned to Global A. So if you look on this sheet and your vehicle is on that sheet, you are a Global A vehicle. It's not labeled as the Global A worksheet. It's actually for GDS2. So the Global Diagnostic System, hence Global A, if GDS2 communicates with that vehicle and that's the scan tool that you use for that vehicle, that is a Global A vehicle.
Awesome.
Doesn't cost you a penny either.
That's great. So with that, we're about at an hour. If we didn't answer your questions, I would suggest you hit us up at webinars@opusivs.com, and if we can answer your question there. And with that, I'd like to say thanks for stopping by and listening, Bill. Thanks for being awesome.
Absolutely.
All right, guys.
Not too bad.
Not too bad tonight, right?
Nope.
All right. All right, guys. We'd like to say good night.
Good night, gentlemen.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.